June 9, 1982, 1400 hours above Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Syrian MiG-23 fighters circled at medium altitude, their pilots watching Israeli formations climbing toward their positions. Syrian ground controllers at Damascus, monitoring radar screens showing the approaching aircraft, transmitted confident assessments to their fighter pilots. American jets approaching from the south. They fly tight formations, predictable routes. Our missile batteries are ready. Easy targets. Below the circling fighters, 19 batteries of Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles covered the valley floor. SA-2 guideline systems, massive installations with tracking radars visible for miles. SA-3 Goa batteries, designed for medium-altitude intercepts. And the feared SA-6 gainful mobile systems, each battery consisting of 4 missiles on tracked launchers, accompanied by straight-flush radar vehicles. These were the same weapons that had devastated the Israeli Air Force in 1973. In that war, 98 Israeli aircraft fell to Arab missiles in just 19 days. Egyptian and Syrian SAM batteries created impenetrable no-fly zones that Israeli pilots couldn't cross without catastrophic losses. The SA-6 proved particularly lethal, destroying dozens of Israeli jets during the war's first week. The Syrian deployment in the Bekaa Valley represented the densest concentration of Soviet air defense systems outside the Warsaw Pact. Each SA-6 battery could engage targets at ranges up to 24 kilometers. The missiles flew at Mach 2.8, making evasion nearly impossible once locked. Supporting the SAM batteries were dozens of ZSU-23-4 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, radar-guided systems that could shred low-flying aircraft with streams of 23mm shells. The equation seemed simple. Israeli fighters could not survive against modern Soviet air defense. The Syrian pilots circling above were witnessing a technological revolution that would rewrite the rules of air warfare. Within 2 hours, those 19 missile batteries would be smoking ruins. By noon the following day, 82 Syrian aircraft would be destroyed without a single Israeli loss in air combat. The mathematics of annihilation were already programmed into Israeli computers. E-2 C Hawkeye radar aircraft orbited offshore, tracking every Syrian fighter from the moment it left the runway. F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons carried AIM-9 L Sidewinder missiles that could engage from any angle. Anti-radiation missiles locked onto radar emissions, turning the Syrians' own detection systems into targeting beacons. The transformation from humiliation to dominance had taken 9 years. But on June 9, 1982, Israel would demonstrate that Western technology, properly integrated and tactically employed, could obliterate Soviet air defense doctrine. This story is about how electronics defeated numbers, how innovation crushed doctrine, and how Soviet military advisors watched in horror as their supposedly impenetrable defense system disintegrated in minutes. The Israeli Air Force had emerged from October 1973 in shock. The Yom Kippur War had exposed a terrifying vulnerability. Egyptian and Syrian missile batteries, operated according to Soviet doctrine, had created zones of death that Israeli pilots couldn't penetrate. In the first week alone, the IAF lost 102 aircraft. 98 fell to surface-to-air missiles, only 4 to enemy fighters. Major General Ezer Weizmann, former IAF commander, captured the despair in a single phrase: "The missile has broken the wing of the aircraft." For an air force built on dominance, on the absolute certainty that Israeli pilots could control the skies, the 1973 disaster was existential. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan had privately suggested Israel might not survive. The missile threat seemed insurmountable, but Major General David Ivory, appointed IAF commander in October 1977, refused to accept this verdict. A quiet, methodical officer who had flown combat missions in every war since 1956, Ivory understood that the problem wasn't unsolvable. It just required thinking differently. "We have to find an answer to the SAM batteries," he told his staff. "Not work around them, not accept losses. Find a way to destroy them completely." The search for that answer would consume Israeli military planners for nearly a decade. It would require technologies that didn't yet exist, tactics that contradicted conventional wisdom, and training programs more intensive than any air force had attempted. The challenge was immense. Soviet air defense doctrine relied on overlapping coverage, redundant systems, and centralized control. SA-2 missiles engaged high-altitude targets. SA-3 systems covered medium altitudes. SA-6 batteries were mobile, could engage low-flying aircraft, and had proven devastatingly effective in 1973. Supporting these were hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, creating walls of steel at lower altitudes. Israeli engineers studying captured equipment and combat footage identified critical vulnerabilities. The missiles required radar guidance. Operators needed clear lines of sight. Command and control depended on centralized ground stations directing fighters to intercepts. Each vulnerability suggested a counter. If missiles needed radar, develop weapons that homed on radar emissions. If operators needed line of sight, use terrain masking and standoff weapons. If command relied on centralized control, jam the communications and destroy the control nodes. But identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them were vastly different challenges. Israel needed technologies its defense industry had never produced. Anti-radiation missiles, remotely piloted vehicles with real-time video transmission, advanced electronic warfare systems, command and control networks integrating multiple aircraft types. Israel Aircraft Industries began developing Scout and Mastiff reconnaissance drones. Unlike American systems that only carried cameras, Israeli drones transmitted real-time video back to command centers. The Israeli Armament Development Authority created anti-radiation missiles based on American AGM-45 and AGM-78 designs, but optimized for Middle Eastern conditions. The breakthrough came with the realization that information dominance mattered more than firepower. An air force that knew where every enemy aircraft was, that could coordinate hundreds of fighters in compressed battlespace, that could blind enemy radar and communications, would win regardless of numerical disadvantage. In 1981, Israel received 4 Grumman E-2 C Hawkeye airborne warning and control system aircraft. The twin-turboprop Hawkeyes carried powerful radar that could track multiple targets simultaneously and data link that information to ground commanders and individual fighters. For the first time in history, an air force could operate with complete situational awareness over an entire battlefield. Every Syrian fighter taking off would be detected instantly. Israeli fighters could be vectored to optimal attack positions before Syrian pilots even knew threats existed. But technology alone couldn't guarantee victory. The human factor remained critical. Israeli pilots trained relentlessly on new tactics, designed specifically to exploit technological advantages. The IAF developed a new doctrine that emphasized information superiority over traditional dogfighting skills. Israeli training emphasized principles drilled into every pilot. Don't dogfight, don't turn with them, use your information advantage and your missiles. Let the Hawkeyes position you perfectly. Trust the system. Pilots practiced attacking mock SAM sites in the Negev desert. They rehearsed communication procedures. They studied Syrian tactics, operational patterns, deployment methods. Israeli intelligence gathered exhaustive data on Syrian radar frequencies, missile engagement envelopes, typical Syrian fighter formations. By early 1982, Israel possessed something unprecedented. An integrated air combat system that merged fighters, electronic warfare, reconnaissance, command and control into a seamless weapon. Against this, Syria fielded equipment and doctrine unchanged since 1973. The Syrians had numbers, experience from continuous fighting, and confidence from their 1973 success, but they were preparing to fight the last war while Israel had designed a completely new way of fighting. In April 1981, Syria deployed its first SAM brigades into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. The move came after Israeli F-16 fighters shot down 2 Syrian helicopters. Syria's President Hafez al-Assad decided his forces in Lebanon needed air defense coverage. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin faced a dilemma. The SAM deployment directly threatened Israeli air operations over Lebanon. It damaged Israeli deterrence, but attacking might trigger unwanted war with Syria. David Ivry studied the deployment carefully. The missiles were positioned in the Bekaa Valley, not defending approaches to Damascus. This suggested Syria had limited objectives, not preparation for major war. Perhaps the batteries could be destroyed without triggering wider conflict. Throughout 1981 and early 1982, Israeli drones flew reconnaissance missions over the Bekaa, testing Syrian radar response times, mapping exact battery locations, recording communication frequencies. Each mission generated data fed into Israeli computers, building a complete electronic picture of Syrian defenses. The intelligence effort was enormous. Israeli electronic warfare aircraft flying along the Lebanese coast captured Syrian radar emissions. Every time a SA-6 straight flush radar activated, Israeli receivers recorded the frequency, pulse repetition rate, scanning pattern. Israeli agents operating in Lebanon photographed SAM sites from ground level, documenting camouflage methods, crew routines, maintenance procedures. Israeli signals intelligence units monitored Syrian military communications continuously. They catalogued voice patterns of Syrian commanders, identified communication procedures, mapped radio networks connecting missile batteries to command centers. When Syrian operators changed frequencies or modified procedures, Israeli operators detected and documented the changes within hours. The Scout remotely piloted vehicles proved invaluable for this intelligence gathering. Each drone carried electro-optical sensors and infrared cameras, providing real-time video transmission to ground stations. Unlike satellites that passed overhead on predictable schedules, drones could loiter for hours, observing Syrian activities continuously. They documented Syrian deployment patterns, recorded how quickly batteries could relocate, identified which sites had the most experienced crews based on their operational discipline. The Mossad obtained technical manuals for Soviet radar systems through sources in Eastern Europe. Israeli engineers studied captured SA-6 components from previous conflicts, including missiles and radar equipment recovered from the 1973 war. They built exact replicas of Syrian radar systems in the Negev desert, testing electronic countermeasures against them repeatedly until Israeli jammers could blind the radars completely. These test facilities allowed Israeli electronic warfare specialists to develop precise jamming profiles for each Syrian radar type. By May 1982, according to author Seymour Hersh, clandestine operations produced a wealth of data on SAM frequencies and radar coverage. Israeli intelligence knew not just where every Syrian battery was positioned, but how Syrian operators used them, their standard procedures, their typical reaction times, even which units were better trained than others. On June 3, 1982, Palestinian terrorists attempted to assassinate Israeli ambassador Shlomo Argov in London. Israel responded with airstrikes against PLO targets in Lebanon. The PLO launched massive artillery bombardments against northern Israeli settlements. On June 6, Israel invaded Lebanon with 60,000 troops in Operation Peace for Galilee. For 3 days, Israeli and Syrian forces clashed cautiously. Syrian President Assad ordered his pilots to avoid direct confrontation. He hoped to maintain the SAM umbrella over Syrian positions without triggering full-scale war. Israeli fighters shot down 7 Syrian MiGs in scattered engagements, testing Syrian reactions, probing their tactics. Then on June 8, Israeli remotely piloted vehicles detected movement. 5 SA-6 batteries were repositioning from Syria's Golan Heights into the Bekaa Valley. Instead of the expected 14 SAM sites, Israel now faced 19. For Ivry and his staff, this solved one problem. The additional deployments confirmed Syria had no intention of fighting to defend Damascus. The missiles were being pushed forward into Lebanon, not pulled back to protect the capital. Israel could attack the Bekaa batteries without triggering wider war. Begin's cabinet debated through the morning of June 9. Some ministers worried about Soviet reaction. The SAM batteries included Soviet advisors. What would Moscow do if its personnel were killed? Others questioned whether the operation would succeed. The 1973 disaster haunted Israeli decision-makers. At 1000 hours, the cabinet authorized the attack. Ivry, monitoring from IAF headquarters in Tel Aviv, postponed the operation until 1400 hours to ensure all aircraft were positioned properly and Syrian patrol patterns were predictable. What happened next would become known as Operation Mole Cricket 19. It would be studied in military academies worldwide as the first time a Western-equipped air force successfully destroyed a Soviet-built integrated air defense network. The operation began with deception. Israeli Scout and Mastiff drones, small, slow-moving aircraft, barely 6 feet long, flew into the Bekaa Valley. Syrian radar operators saw what appeared to be Israeli attack aircraft. SAM batteries activated their tracking radars, preparing to engage. The instant those radars illuminated, Israeli electronic warfare aircraft detected the emissions. Precise locations were transmitted to command centers and to F-4 Phantom fighters loitering behind mountain ridges south of the valley. At 1400 hours exactly, the first wave struck. 26 F-4E Phantoms popped up above the ridgeline just long enough to launch AGM-78 standard anti-radiation missiles from 19 miles out. The missiles, essentially repurposed American naval weapons adapted for air launch, flew at supersonic speed following radar beams back to their source like bloodhounds following a scent. Each standard arm missile weighed 1,400 pounds, carried a 214-pound warhead, and could home on radar emissions from up to 35 miles away. When Syrian straight-flush radars illuminated to track targets, they created electromagnetic highways leading directly to themselves. The missiles followed these invisible paths with perfect precision. Syrian operators saw the attack developing. Radar screens showed incoming targets. Missile crews responded exactly as Soviet doctrine prescribed. They launched 57 SA-6 missiles at the approaching Israeli aircraft. The missiles leaped from their launchers on pillars of white smoke, accelerating to Mach 2.8, guidance systems tracking targets selected by the straight-flush radars. Every single missile missed. Israeli electronic countermeasure pods jammed the guidance systems. The missiles corkscrewed wildly, detonating harmlessly or crashing into hillsides. The electronic warfare was surgical. Israeli Boeing 707 aircraft, converted into flying electronic warfare platforms, transmitted carefully calibrated jamming signals that confused SA-6 guidance radars. The Syrian radars saw ghost targets, multiple false returns, targets that flickered in and out of existence. Missile guidance computers, receiving contradictory information from their radars, couldn't calculate proper intercept courses. Meanwhile, Israeli chaff dispensers released clouds of metallized fibers that created massive radar returns. Syrian operators saw their screens suddenly fill with dozens of apparent targets, which were real aircraft, which were chaff clouds, which were electronic phantoms created by Israeli jammers. The operators couldn't tell, while Syrian missile crews struggled with phantom targets and jammed radars. The AGM-78 anti-radiation missiles reached their targets. 10 SAM battery radars were destroyed by 1410 hours. Massive explosions obliterated the straight-flush radar vans. Without their guidance radars, the SA-6 missiles became useless. The launchers could fire, but the missiles had no way to find targets. 10 minutes. 10 radars obliterated by missiles fired from beyond visual range. Syrian commanders watching from Damascus couldn't comprehend what was happening. Their missile batteries were simply disappearing. The second wave arrived at 14:35. 40. A-4 Skyhawks and Kfir fighters swept into the valley at low altitude, spreading cluster bombs across the actual missile launchers. F-4S, using 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, demolished surviving radar vans and control vehicles. By 14:45 hours, 17 of 19 batteries had been destroyed. Total time elapsed, 45 minutes. The entire Syrian air defense network in the Bekaa Valley had been methodically annihilated without a single Israeli aircraft lost. But Syria wasn't surrendering without a fight. As the SAM batteries died, Syrian air defense commanders scrambled fighters. If missiles couldn't stop the Israelis, perhaps fighters could. Israeli remotely piloted vehicles orbiting over 3 major Syrian air bases detected the launches immediately. Data flowed to E-2 C Hawkeyes orbiting off the Lebanese coast. Controllers aboard the Hawkeyes tracked every Syrian fighter from the moment wheels left runway. The Syrians launched over 100 aircraft, MiG-21 fishbeds, the backbone of the Syrian Air Force, MiG-23 floggers, newer but still export models with downgraded systems, Su-20 attack aircraft. They formed up according to Soviet doctrine, flying in tight formations at medium altitude. Israeli F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons were already positioned exactly where the Hawkeye controllers wanted them. The Syrians were flying into a carefully prepared killing zone. Syrian fighters depended on ground-controlled intercept stations for targeting information. Ground controllers would detect enemy aircraft, calculate intercepts, and radio vectors to Syrian pilots. Soviet doctrine centralized command and control. Fighter pilots followed instructions from ground controllers, who supposedly had superior situational awareness from their radar stations. But Israeli electronic warfare aircraft were systematically jamming Syrian ground control frequencies. Israeli operators knew exactly which frequencies Syrian ground controllers used. They transmitted precisely calibrated jamming signals on those frequencies, creating walls of electronic noise that blocked communication between Syrian controllers and pilots. Syrian ground controllers shouted vectors into their radios. Their pilots heard only static, electronic squeals, and occasional fragments of words. Syrian flight leaders tried to take command, to coordinate their formations without ground control. But their short-range radios also faced jamming. Individual pilots found themselves isolated, unable to communicate with ground control, wingmen, or flight leaders. A Western military observer, quoted later in a Rand Corporation report, watched Syrian fighters through binoculars from a hilltop position. I watched a group of Syrian fighter planes fly figure eights. They just flew around and obviously had no idea what to do next. Their formation discipline collapsed. They scattered across the sky, each pilot trying desperately to spot threats visually while maintaining some semblance of tactical awareness. Cut off from ground control, Syrian pilots were blind. Their MiG-21s had only forward-looking and tail-warning radars. No side coverage, no look-down capability. The export model MiG-23s had better radars than the MiG-21s, but still lacked the sophisticated systems of Western fighters. Syrian pilots were trained to rely on ground controllers to vector them to targets. Now, alone in confused skies, they faced enemies they couldn't detect. Israeli F-15s and F-16s, guided by Hawkeye controllers with complete situational awareness, positioned themselves on the Syrian flanks where the MiGs had no radar coverage. The Israeli fighters carried AIM-7F Sparrow radar-guided missiles with ranges exceeding 25 miles, and AIM-9 L Sidewinder infrared-guided missiles effective to 10 miles. The AIM-9L represented a revolutionary advance over earlier Sidewinder models. Previous versions could only engage targets from directly behind, locked onto hot engine exhausts. Syrian pilots trained extensively in defensive maneuvers against rear hemisphere attacks, knowing that braking hard and presenting a cooler aspect to pursuing missiles would often break the lock. The 9L model changed everything. Its seeker could detect and track targets from any angle. Front quarter, side aspect, even head-on engagements were possible. Syrian pilots executing their trained defensive brakes found missiles tracking them from angles they thought were safe. The missile's solid propellant motors burned for several seconds, accelerating to Mach 2.5. Terminal homing was so precise that missiles often impacted within feet of their aim points. Israeli pilots exploited this technological advantage systematically. With complete situational awareness from Hawkeye controllers, Israeli fighters positioned themselves optimally before Syrian pilots even knew threats existed. Radar-guided Sparrow missiles engaged at beyond visual range. Heat-seeking Sidewinders finished any aircraft that survived the initial engagement. The combination proved devastating. In the first 30 minutes of air combat, Israeli fighters shot down 26 Syrian aircraft. The Syrians never got a single confirmed kill. David Ivory, monitoring the battle from his command post in Tel Aviv, listened to radio reports as Israeli pilots calmly called out kills. F-15 engaged, Fox 2. Splash 1, F-16 engaged, Fox 2, Splash 1, and the more they came, the lack of confidence on their side increased, Ivory recalled. You're losing and losing. Once you start to lose, you think, well, I'm going to be a target. I'm going to go over there because I've been summoned. By 1600 hours, the air battle had ended. Syrian commanders recalled surviving fighters. The losses were catastrophic. 29 aircraft destroyed on June 9th alone. The SAM batteries were gone. Israeli fighters owned the airspace over Lebanon completely. Total Israeli losses in air combat: 0. The numbers shocked even Israeli commanders. In 2 hours, they had accomplished what seemed impossible just years before. Soviet air defense doctrine, supposedly refined through decades of study and testing, had been completely defeated. But June 9th was just the beginning. The following day, Syria sent up another massive formation trying to challenge Israeli air superiority. The results were identical. Israeli F-15s and F-16s, coordinated by Hawkeye controllers, shredded the Syrian formations. 35 more Syrian aircraft fell. By June 11th, when a ceasefire took effect, the count stood at 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed. Some sources suggest the final toll reached 87 by the end of July, as sporadic fighting continued. Israel lost 1 RF-4 reconnaissance aircraft and 1 A-4 Skyhawk, both to anti-aircraft fire, not enemy fighters. In air-to-air combat, the kill ratio was 82-0. The destruction of Syrian air power sent shock waves through military establishments worldwide. But nowhere was the impact more profound than in Moscow. The Soviet Union had equipped and trained the Syrian military. Soviet doctrine governed Syrian tactics. Soviet advisors supervised operations. Soviet equipment filled Syrian arsenals. And all of it had been systematically obliterated by Western technology operated by a small air force with only a few hundred modern fighters. Within days of the ceasefire, the Soviet Union dispatched Chief Marshal Pavel Stepanovich Kutakov to Syria. Kutakov, Commander-in-Chief of Soviet Air Forces since 1969, was one of the Soviet military's most decorated officers. A flying ace from World War II, with over 500 combat missions, he had built the modern Soviet Air Force. Now he flew to Damascus to find out how Israel had destroyed it so easily. Accompanying Kutakov was General Urasov, Deputy Commander of Soviet Air Defense Forces. Western diplomats in Damascus, watching the hurried arrival of such senior Soviet military figures, understood the implications. Soviet military planners were stunned by the accuracy and efficiency of the Israeli attack, one diplomat reported to Washington. The general must try to assess how the Israelis managed to knock out all these Syrian air defense missiles so apparently easily. Soviet fears went beyond Syria. NATO faced the same Soviet air defense systems across the Iron Curtain. If Israel could destroy 19 SAM batteries in minutes, what could NATO do against the hundreds of batteries defending East Germany and the Western Soviet Union? The Soviet military newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda initially tried to salvage pride. 67 Israeli aircraft, including modern US-made F-15 and F-16 fighters, were downed in the fighting, the paper announced. The newspaper reported meeting a Syrian airman who recounted shooting down an Israeli F-15. The victory had not been easy. The enemy had been subtle. Even within Soviet ranks, these claims met great skepticism. The numbers didn't match reports from multiple sources. Syrian pilots who survived told different stories. Some admitted they never even saw the Israeli fighters that killed them. Marshal Kutakov spent weeks in Syria examining wreckage, interviewing Syrian pilots, studying tactical reports. His team analyzed, destroyed SAM batteries, reviewed combat recordings, debriefed surviving Syrian officers. The findings were devastating. The report delivered to Soviet leadership in late June 1982 revealed fundamental problems with Soviet air combat doctrine. Israeli electronic warfare had completely negated Soviet command and control systems. The centralized control that Soviet doctrine demanded, which worked effectively in exercises and against less sophisticated opponents, became a fatal weakness when communication links were jammed. Syrian fighters became helpless when ground controllers couldn't reach them. Syrian SAM systems couldn't adapt to Israeli tactics. The missiles performed exactly as designed. They could destroy aircraft if properly employed. But Soviet doctrine required operators to track targets manually, compute firing solutions using standard procedures. Israeli standoff weapons destroyed radars before missiles could engage. Israeli electronic warfare confused tracking systems. The supposedly mobile SA-6 batteries had been deployed in fixed positions for weeks, negating their primary advantage of mobility and making them easy targets for Israeli intelligence. Most damning, Soviet export fighters couldn't match Western technology. The MiG-21 was obsolete. The export model MiG-23 lacked the advanced radar and weapons of the Soviet version. Syrian pilots received adequate training, but couldn't overcome equipment disadvantages. U.S. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, briefing President Ronald Reagan, summarized the Soviet problem bluntly. Their equipment is a generation behind ours in critical areas: electronic warfare, sensors, missiles, command and control. The Syrians fought with one hand tied behind their backs. Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz, director of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, noted another critical factor. The Syrians used mobile missiles in a fixed configuration. They put the radars in the valley instead of the hills because they didn't want to dig latrines. Seriously. Soviet laziness and Syrian incompetence certainly contributed to defeat, but the core problem was technological. Western systems, properly integrated, were simply superior. A year after the battle, the U.S. Air Force sent Lieutenant General John Chain, Deputy Chief of Staff for Plans and Operations, to Israel to study Operation Mole Cricket 19. Chain's team spent weeks interviewing Israeli pilots, examining tactics, reviewing electronic warfare techniques. The lessons learned would directly influence U.S. planning for future conflicts. Electronic warfare capabilities accelerated. Integration between AWACS aircraft and fighters tightened. Anti-radiation missile development intensified. When the United States went to war against Iraq in 1991, Operation Desert Storm's opening hours looked remarkably similar to Operation Mole Cricket 19. Israel's victory demonstrated several revolutionary concepts. First, that information dominance was the key to air superiority. An air force that knew where every enemy aircraft was could defeat numerically superior forces through positioning and coordination. Second, that electronic warfare could negate traditional air defense doctrine. Jamming communications between ground controllers and fighters turned Soviet centralized control from strength to weakness. Third, that standoff weapons fundamentally changed the SAM versus aircraft equation. If fighters could destroy radar sites from beyond missile range, the defensive advantage disappeared. Fourth, that training and tactical innovation mattered as much as technology. Israeli pilots weren't better because they were inherently superior. They were better because they trained more intensively, understood their systems more thoroughly, and operated within a command structure that encouraged initiative and flexibility. The psychological impact on Syrian pilots was profound. Men who had fought confidently in 1973 became demoralized. Many refused to fly missions. Some senior pilots requested transfers to ground positions rather than face Israeli fighters again. Syrian commanders struggled to maintain morale among pilots who understood they faced overwhelming technological disadvantage with no immediate solution. Syrian Minister of Defense Mustafa Tlass visited Moscow in mid-June, seeking Soviet intervention. The Soviets refused direct military involvement but prepared massive equipment shipments: more fighters, more missiles, more electronic warfare systems, and, crucially, more advisors. By late 1982, over 1,500 Soviet advisors deployed to Syria. They supervised operations, trained pilots, installed new equipment. Soviet technicians operated the most advanced systems directly. The Kremlin couldn't afford to let Syria collapse completely, but neither would it risk direct confrontation with Israel backed by the United States. President Assad, meeting with Syrian military leadership, drew harsh conclusions. Syrian Air Force Chief of Staff Ibrahim Safi was fired. New training programs launched, emphasizing electronic warfare awareness and decentralized command. Syria began purchasing surface-to-surface missiles, Scud ballistic missiles that could strike Israel without facing air defenses. Ivory cited conclusions drawn by the Syrian Minister of Defense, who felt that Israeli air power and electronic warfare won the day in the Bekaa Valley, and the next war would be a surface-to-surface war, and not the surface-to-air war anymore. Ivory recalled. That's when they started to buy the Scuds. The balance had shifted permanently. Syrian pilots understood they couldn't challenge Israeli air superiority. Syria's strategy evolved toward missiles, terrorism, proxy forces, anything that avoided direct air combat with Israel. In 1991, David Ivory, by then Israel's ambassador to the United States, met a Czech general who had served in Moscow during 1982. The general shared a remarkable perspective. The Bekaa Valley air war made the Soviets understand that Western technology was superior to theirs, the general told Ivry. And in my view, the blow to the Bekaa Valley SAMs was part of the cascade of events leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The claim seemed extraordinary. Could one 2-hour air battle contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse? But the logic was compelling. The Soviet military's credibility rested on the perception that Soviet equipment and doctrine could match the West. The Bekaa Valley demonstrated conclusively that Soviet systems were inferior. Soviet military officers who had believed their air defense networks could blunt NATO air power suddenly faced undeniable evidence they were wrong. This contributed to growing doubts about Soviet military effectiveness, economic viability, technological capability. The accumulated weight of these doubts eventually led to glasnost, perestroika, and ultimately the Soviet Union's dissolution. Whether the Bekaa Valley directly caused Soviet collapse is debatable, but it certainly contributed to the erosion of Soviet military confidence. The operation also validated several specific technologies that would reshape modern warfare. The combat debut of AWACS aircraft proved their worth. E-2 C Hawkeyes had provided the coordination making the lopsided victory possible. Every major air force would subsequently acquire similar systems. The United States accelerated development of the E-3 Sentry AWACS program. NATO ordered additional aircraft. Even nations that couldn't afford full AWACS systems invested in airborne early warning platforms. Remotely piloted vehicles demonstrated their value beyond reconnaissance. Israeli drones had provided real-time intelligence, detected missile launches, baited SAM batteries into revealing positions. More critically, they proved that unmanned systems could operate in high-threat environments where manned aircraft faced unacceptable risk. The concept of unmanned aircraft serving as force multipliers became standard doctrine across Western militaries. Anti-radiation missiles transformed the SAM versus aircraft balance permanently. After the Bekaa Valley, air defense forces worldwide understood that turning on radar could be fatal. Soviet and Warsaw Pact air defense doctrine underwent immediate revision. SAM operators were trained to activate radars for minimum necessary time. Decoy emitters were developed to confuse anti-radiation missiles. Mobile SAM systems were required to relocate immediately after firing. This forced SAM operators to become more cautious and less effective, providing attacking aircraft more freedom of action. The integration of electronic warfare with kinetic strikes became the template for future operations. Israel had demonstrated that jamming enemy communications, destroying command nodes, and exploiting information dominance could achieve results impossible through firepower alone. Every Western Air Force studied Israeli methods. Electronic warfare became a separate specialty, with dedicated squadrons and aircraft. Investment in jamming systems, signals intelligence, and electronic attack capabilities accelerated dramatically. Beyond technology, the battle demonstrated the importance of realistic training. Israeli pilots had practiced extensively against mock SAM sites. They understood Syrian tactics. They trained in communication procedures. When combat came, everything was familiar. Syrian pilots, by contrast, trained in clear weather, predictable scenarios, simple exercises. Combat overwhelmed them. The kill-to-loss ratios spoke for themselves. In the 3 days of most intense fighting, Israeli fighters shot down over 60 Syrian aircraft without a single loss. Extending through July, the total reached 82-0 in air-to-air combat. This wasn't just victory, it was dominance approaching the absolute. American defense analysts studied the results intensively. The Pentagon hosted Israeli briefings, where David Ivry and his staff explained tactics, technologies, coordination methods. Much of what became standard U.S. Air Force doctrine originated from lessons learned in the Bekaa Valley. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, American planners designing Operation Desert Storm drew explicitly from Israeli experience. The opening hours of Desert Storm on January 17, 1991, looked remarkably similar to Mole Cricket 19. F-4G Wild Weasel aircraft, carrying AGM-88 HARM missiles with improved range and seeker capabilities over earlier anti-radiation weapons. Hunted Iraqi radars, using tactics refined from Israeli operations. EA-6B Prowler electronic warfare aircraft, jammed Iraqi communications and radar systems using techniques pioneered by Israel. E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft coordinated over 700 coalition fighters during the opening night alone, following procedures developed after studying Israeli operations. Iraqi air defenses mirrored the Syrian model. Soviet-built SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 missiles integrated with French Roland systems and indigenous modifications. Over 3,000 anti-aircraft guns provided layered coverage. Centralized command and control from Baghdad directed fighter intercepts using Soviet doctrine. On paper, Iraq fielded one of the world's most formidable air defense networks. Coalition forces destroyed Iraq's integrated air defense system in under 48 hours. Precision weapons eliminated command bunkers and communication nodes. Anti-radiation missiles obliterated radar sites. Electronic warfare blinded Iraqi operators. F-15 and F-16 fighters established complete air superiority, shooting down Iraqi aircraft in lopsided engagements that echoed the Bekaa Valley kill ratios. American commanders who had studied the Bekaa Valley operation recognized they faced similar challenges in Iraq. Saddam Hussein had built his air defense network following Soviet doctrine, equipped with Soviet weapons, operated using Soviet procedures. The same vulnerabilities Israel exploited in 1982 remained exploitable in 1991. The results in 1991 mirrored 1982. Coalition forces destroyed Iraq's air defense network in hours. Iraqi fighters fled to Iran or were shot down in lopsided engagements. The coalition achieved total air superiority, enabling the ground war to proceed with minimal casualties. Israel had written the playbook. The United States refined it to industrial scale. In private discussions, senior American officers credited Israeli innovation for demonstrating what integrated technology and advanced tactics could achieve against Soviet-style defenses. The operational concepts, validated in the Bekaa Valley, directly influenced U.S. planning for future conflicts with Soviet-equipped opponents. The personnel factors mattered as much as technology. Israeli pilots typically accumulated 400 to 500 hours of training before entering combat. Syrian pilots received less than 200 hours. But the difference wasn't just quantity, it was quality and realism. Israeli pilots practiced against dissimilar aircraft, learning to fight enemies with different performance characteristics. They flew in challenging weather, trained in realistic electronic warfare environments that simulated Soviet jamming and radar systems. Israeli training emphasized decision-making under pressure, tactical flexibility, maintaining situational awareness in chaotic combat. Syrian pilots, by contrast, trained in clear weather, permissive environments, following scripted exercises. Soviet doctrine emphasized following procedures rather than adapting to circumstances. Syrian pilots learned to execute specific maneuvers in specific situations. When actual combat deviated from training scenarios, when ground control failed and circumstances changed rapidly, Syrian training hadn't prepared them to adapt. Israeli pilots operated within a command structure encouraging initiative. If a tactical situation changed, pilots could adapt without waiting for orders. Syrian pilots followed rigid procedures. When ground control communications were jammed, they had no backup plans. The difference appeared in documented accounts. Israeli pilots consistently describe making split-second decisions, adapting tactics mid-flight, exploiting opportunities as they emerged. Syrian pilots describe waiting for instructions, following rigid patterns, confusion when communications failed. The contrast in command philosophy directly impacted combat effectiveness. By late 1982, the pattern was clear. Syrian pilots avoided engagement if possible. When forced to fight, they operated defensively, hoping to survive rather than expecting to win. The psychological edge had shifted completely. The operation's success rested on integrating multiple systems into a coordinated whole. E-2 C Hawkeyes provided surveillance and battle management. Electronic warfare aircraft jammed Syrian communications and radar. Remotely piloted vehicles detected launches and relayed real-time intelligence. Anti-radiation missiles destroyed SAM radars. F-4 Phantoms struck SAM launchers with precision weapons. F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons established air superiority. Ground-based artillery suppressed anti-aircraft guns. Each element was important, but the integration mattered more than individual components. Syrian forces had capable equipment, but their systems didn't communicate effectively. Command and control was centralized and vulnerable. Electronic warfare capabilities were primitive. Training emphasized rote procedure over adaptation. Israel had built an integrated system where information flowed seamlessly. Commanders could coordinate hundreds of aircraft in compressed airspace. Pilots understood how each piece contributed to overall success. This integration created a force far more capable than the sum of individual technologies. The final statistics demonstrated the completeness of Israeli victory. 17 of 19 SAM batteries in the Bekaa Valley destroyed on June 9th alone. The remaining 2 batteries eliminated on June 10th. In total, 29 of 30 Syrian SAM batteries across Lebanon and the border area were destroyed over 2 days. 82 Syrian aircraft shot down by June 11th. 0 Israeli losses in air-to-air combat. Over 1,000 Israeli combat sorties flown. The human cost to Syria was severe. 29 pilots killed on June 9th alone. By July, at least 87 pilots and weapons systems officers lost. Each loss represented years of training, combat experience that Syria couldn't quickly replace. Syrian Air Force morale collapsed. Surviving pilots reported to their squadrons knowing they faced overwhelming technological disadvantage. Some requested transfers to ground positions rather than fly again. Others developed physical symptoms of stress before missions. Syrian commanders tried to maintain fighting spirit through patriotic appeals and assurances that newer Soviet equipment would arrive soon. Training programs couldn't replace experienced pilots quickly enough. Syria's flight schools were already operating at capacity. Accelerating training meant graduating less prepared pilots who would be even more vulnerable. Equipment losses forced Syria to accept massive Soviet resupply with the political strings attached. More advisors, more oversight, more Soviet influence over Syrian military operations. For Israel, the victory validated nearly a decade of painful innovation. The humiliation of 1973 had been avenged. The claim that missiles had broken the wing of the aircraft was decisively refuted. Israeli Air Force confidence soared. David Ivory, addressing his commanders after the ceasefire, cautioned against overconfidence. "We succeeded because we prepared thoroughly. We understood our enemies. We trained intensively. We integrated our systems perfectly. We executed flawlessly. If we become complacent, if we stop innovating, if we assume technological advantage alone guarantees victory, we'll face another 1973. His warning proved prescient. Military advantages erode quickly. Opponents study defeats, adapt tactics, acquire new technologies. What works today may fail tomorrow. Continuous innovation and realistic assessment of both friendly and enemy capabilities remain essential. But on June 9th and 10th, 1982, Israel demonstrated what was possible when technological advantage, superior training, innovative tactics, and flawless execution combined. The lessons learned that day would influence military aviation for decades. In Moscow, military planners drew their own conclusions. Soviet equipment needed modernization. Electronic warfare capabilities required massive investment. Fighter designs needed improvement. Training programs needed reform. Centralized command structures needed revision. Some of these lessons were implemented. New fighters like the MiG-29 and Su-27 addressed capability gaps. Electronic warfare systems improved. Training intensity increased, but the fundamental problems remained. Soviet technology lagged Western systems. Soviet doctrine struggled to adapt to electronic warfare realities. Soviet training couldn't match Western intensity. The gap would persist until the Soviet Union's collapse, and the memory of the Bekaa Valley, where 19 missile batteries and 82 aircraft disappeared in 2 days, haunted Soviet military planning until the end. At Israel's Air Force Museum at Hatzarim Air Base, one of the E-2 C Hawkeyes that participated in Operation Mole Cricket 19 sits on display. Visitors can view the radar dome, examine the operator stations, understand the technology that enabled Israeli victory. A small placard describes the operation. On June 9 and 10, 1982, E-2 C Hawkeyes provided battle management for the largest air engagement since the Korean War. Coordinating hundreds of Israeli fighters, the Hawkeyes enabled destruction of Syrian air defenses and the downing of 82 enemy aircraft without Israeli loss. But the complete story remains partially classified. Specific electronic warfare techniques, exact intelligence collection methods, detailed tactical procedures, these remain sensitive decades later. Operation Mole Cricket 19 marked a decisive turning point in military aviation. It demonstrated that Western technology, properly integrated and professionally employed, could decisively defeat Soviet air defense doctrine. More critically, it proved that information dominance, electronic warfare, superiority, and tactical innovation mattered as much as hardware. Technology provided the tools, but training, integration, and doctrine determined victory. When Marshal Kutakov returned to Moscow and reported his findings, Soviet military leadership confronted an undeniable technology gap. Western electronic warfare, sensors, precision weapons, and command and control systems had proven decisively superior. The implications extended beyond Syria. If Israel could destroy 19 SAM batteries and 82 aircraft in 2 days, NATO could potentially achieve similar results against Warsaw Pact defenses. The Bekaa Valley shattered Soviet assumptions about conventional military capabilities. The comfortable belief that Soviet quantity could compensate for Western quality evaporated. Soviet military confidence, already strained by multiple setbacks, sustained another profound blow. Whether this single battle contributed directly to Soviet collapse remains debatable, but it certainly demonstrated to Soviet leadership that their confidence in military superiority was misplaced. The transformation from 1973 humiliation to 1982 triumph represented 9 years of painful innovation and relentless preparation. Israeli persistence produced results that shocked military establishments worldwide and fundamentally altered assumptions about modern air warfare. The sky above the Bekaa Valley belonged not to the side with the most aircraft or missiles, but to the side with superior information, better integration, and the determination to innovate.